Hello and welcome to the Informal Comms Formal Risk webinar hosted by Insurance Times in association with Hiscox. My name is Yanis Katoulis, editor at Insurance Times, and I'll be hosting today's panel discussion as we take a dive into the recent report released by Hiscox, which explores the changing risks being faced by the CPS sector. Before I introduce the panel, however, just a few quick housekeeping notes. If you are hearing this, then you are, as I'm sure you're already aware, viewing the recorded version of this webinar, so we'll not be able to send in questions for our panel to respond to live, even though you will hear us discussing the audience Q&A. You do have the advantage, however, of being able to pause whenever you want, so there's no stress about having to jump up and answer the door. But with that out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce the panel for today. So joining us from Hiscox, we have the insurer's Consultancy and Professional Services sector lead, Max Dobrov. Welcome, Max.
Hello.
And bringing legal expertise to the panel, I'm also glad to welcome Lucy Tolland, who is partner at DWF Law. Morning, Lucy.
Morning.
And lastly, and not leastly, we bring the broker perspective in through Chris Cotterill, who is client director at Concilio with long experience of the CPS sector. Good to have you with us, Chris.
See you.
So, with introductions made, let's jump into today's topic. Hiscox's new Blurring the Lines of Communication report recently investigated the changing nature of professional services communications, finding that 86% of firms were receiving client requests through informal channels, such as WhatsApp, every week. But as professionals increasingly make use of this method of communication, the report noted a number of risks that can come alongside this, including factors such as client misinterpretation leading to losses and difficulties keeping up with audit trails. Max, I wondered if, before we dive into the risks, you would mind starting us off by giving an overview of how communications in the professional services sector have changed in the last 5 to 10 years and why you think that is as well.
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying that the primary driver for commissioning this report has been something that we have been observing in the consultancy and profession space and sort of the claims environment that we are seeing from our clients. And we noticed a very interesting trend is that over the years, we see more and more elements of claims and disputes that we are seeing as an insurer, now featuring things like references to informal messaging services, WhatsApps, team groups, various group chats and work chats on platforms that aren't necessarily associated with sort of professional sector, which tended to be written letter or email. And as I said, as we observed it and we kind of spotted that trend, we thought it was interesting. Wonder how that impacts on sort of our client base. And we thought we'd conduct this research and this report. And I think the results have come up quite interesting, quite competitive, which we're going to discuss today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you say, the changing nature of those communications really has, we've all experienced it in our personal lives, in our professional lives. There are risks that potentially come alongside that as well. And I wanted to start, maybe you could start us with this one, Lucy, by asking about what you think is maybe driving this change in the rise of non-formal communication in professional life and what you think is driving that.
Sure. I think it's certainly true that there has been an absolute sea change in the way that we communicate as a society and as professionals with our clients. I think part of it was probably driven by COVID. So, people went through quite a long stint of working from home, and remote working, certainly for lawyers and for lots of other professionals as well, is really embedded now in what we do. And that means that the older ways of communication have perhaps been superseded to some degree by these more informal platforms, such as WhatsApp, Slack, Teams, and there has been quite a marked evolution, I think, in the last 10 years on how we communicate generally and as professionals with our clients. It's also something that clients, I think, want and expect to be able to communicate more freely via these channels, and obviously as professional services firms, we will want to respond to our clients in the way that they want to be communicated with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of covers how the risk is developing as well. But maybe we could just quickly go back to what the potential liabilities are for people working in these things as well, because there's such a range of professions that work in the kind of broad umbrella of professional services. But what are some of the risks that they're actually facing?
Well, it's absolutely clear now that these sort of informal communications can carry legal weight and can create legal responsibilities. And there's two particular authorities on that. So there's the JV Holmes and Fincham case, where an exchange of WhatsApp messages between a developer and a contractor, even though it was informal, was held to have be evidence of a concluded contract, so contractual obligations. And also the DAZN Limited decision, where an agreement regarding broadcasting rights for the World Cup, so very topical, was concluded in a legally binding way over WhatsApp. So legal obligations can and absolutely are arising via these informal channels. Even where strict legal obligations aren't being created, then obviously these sorts of communications can be key evidence. And where there are claims and complaints against professionals, they'll form part of the evidential record.
Yeah, I can absolutely see the risks there, and I think it's something maybe that you could comment on, Chris, as a broker. I mean, you fall into that professional services role yourself as well, and I mean, what are some of those potential implications, the risks that come with sending client communications informally?
When it comes to communicating out of hours or via WhatsApp, it's all about then there's potential for miscommunication. You're not putting in enough detail, or things are done at speed because you're doing it on the evenings and people might be trying to put their kids to bed, or you're out on a sports day. And you can then fall foul of situations where you're trying to do the best for your clients in picking up a phone call on, say, a Saturday, and you have best intentions. Okay, something we can look at, something we can do. But then by only get half the picture, half the story, come Monday, you realise you weren't told something because it was just one or two sentences on the WhatsApp, or it was a brief conversation down the pub. Oh yes, we can do this. And yeah, without having the formal process of whether it be a contract or a full FCA regulated email, everything is open then to interpretation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as a journalist myself, I'm very aware of how different words and different sentences can be open to interpretation. But you guys operating in regulated sectors where that carries legal weight, like Lucy was just talking about, I can see that the risks associated with that are far greater and could potentially be quite challenging. Maxim, obviously that's something that you investigated in the report that Hiscox put together as well. Does that echo what Chris was just saying?
Yes, absolutely. Some of the findings in the report clearly talk about kind of miscommunication, misunderstandings, sort of something that we internally refer to as a scope creep, where maybe boundaries of something that was originally agreed upon and signed in a more formalized contractual way then kind of erodes slowly through various informal messages in various groups and sort of now becomes an implied part of the contract without actually being there from the beginning. And as I said, whenever we see disputes and disagreements between our clients that lead to claims, those things tend to creep up more and more often. So absolutely something to be mindful of, which is why partially we're doing this webinar.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that maybe a lot of people watching this webinar will have experience of as well, the pressure that comes with feeling the need to respond to people out of hours, and there's a competitive element there as well in the professional services sector as well. Is that something that you feel as well, Chris? Is there that kind of pressure on professionals?
Yeah, it's not all just based on best price. It is a service, and a lot of professional clients are busy doing their own work during the day, and they want to be able to catch up out of hours. And being able to go that extra mile means that's what our clients prefer, really.
Yeah, I can see the benefit, but as we say, it's something that needs to be managed properly on our side when we're communicating with clients as well. And I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's not just the method of communication. So obviously, responding to a WhatsApp out of hours, that can absolutely put you in some water if you're not kind of tracking those and auditing those messages. But also, it's not the method of communication; it's also the content. So as someone that works in an office, you often get emails that include emojis, and that can be something that is misinterpreted. I know that's something that you've said is quite important as well, Lucy, if you could speak to that.
I think that's absolutely right. As you say, Alice, it's not just the method, it's a whole new language and a whole different way of communicating. And there are some really good examples given in the Hiscox paper, in some of the case studies about what could arise, different interpretations around language that's being used. So, what do particular emojis mean? What do abbreviations mean? So that it's not just the way that we're communicating, but the language that we're using is evolving. And different generations might also have different understandings of what different emojis and terms mean, depending on the context in which they're used. So if you think, a thumbs up or a laughing face emoji, something like that, you might think you know what that means, but actually depending on the context of the message, who it's been sent to, the timing, could actually be quite difficult to interpret what was actually meant if somebody is not using sort of old-fashioned language. I know we had a really interesting debate in my team recently about the use of full stops in messages, right, and how different generations interpret that differently. And I was told by some of the much younger members in my team that using a full stop in a message is quite abrupt, which was news to me. So, we're all learning about these new ways to communicate, and I can certainly see that there will be scope for potential misinterpretation or discussion about what particular terms mean and what was meant by them.
Absolutely. I think I've absolutely run into that full stop conversation myself and been told that maybe I need to add a smiley face to make it sound like I am my normal self over digital messaging as well. But it's a really interesting point. And I think it is, like Lucy said, Max, something that you looked at in the report and professionals were saying is something that they don't feel entirely comfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely. That was definitely a theme that came out of the report. But I suppose in a way it was outweighed by some of the positive messaging behind it as well. So a lot of our professionals that responded in our research understandably say that being able to quickly respond to their client queries, being available, being nimble, especially depending on some of the sectors that some of our professionals are in, help them win business, help them retain clients, help them build relationships. Most of them see that as something far more valuable than maybe a risk of a misinterpreted emoji or some kind of a loss in translation message. So yeah, that was definitely another theme in the report.
Absolutely, and I think really important to highlight the positives, and it is kind of our sector and the way it communicates is a reflection of wider society, which of course has gone on to, I can't remember the last time I sent a letter, and the last time I sent a WhatsApp was probably just before we got on the webinar. So you can see what that means. And I think the emoji point that you make, Lucy, is particularly pertinent because a thumbs up can mean, yes, I agree, or it can mean message received and I'll read it later, depending on the context. And I think that's something that maybe you've run into as well, Chris. Is that something you can comment on, the use of emojis?
Yeah, I'm just echoing Lucy, really. Yeah, it's about when I used to look at a thumb, I used to like yes received. What some of my colleagues is that's a go. Yes, let's start a policy. It's like, oh no, I'm just saying I've received it. It's okay. Right. And it's how a person interprets it themselves. Smiley face, or is it a wink? And yeah, definitely easier to have clarity with the sentence.
Absolutely, I think that's the advantage of formal language, and it's something that maybe especially the younger generations and the texting world might not have, and it's maybe something that the formal professional services sector needs to face into because, as you say, Max, it's not going away, and there are so many positives to that method of communication. But as we were talking about, I mean, it's something we've touched on briefly already, but there's this blurring of boundaries that comes with this. I mean, I think back in the day, you used to be at work and you'd reply to people or meet them and reply in kind of formal, full English that's clear and it lays out exactly what you want. And that's, for example, how we lay out our insurance policies when we're providing cover to a client. But in our communications with clients, and especially in the professional services sector, that's not always something we can do. And I think that sort of undefined, more relaxed communication being taken as business advice is something that a lot of CPS professionals won't feel comfortable with. And how do you think that can be addressed, Lucy?
I think that's absolutely right. The issue around the blurring of boundaries, and there's all sorts of issues that arise out of that, whether related to risk, claim risk, and also looking after our employees and staff. Certainly for me, as the mum of two quite young kids, having the ability to respond to my clients out of hours without being at my desk is enormously valuable. But we all have to remember that the element of being always on is not always great for everybody. So we do have to be mindful about that risk of blurring boundaries for our staff and making sure that there are boundaries around that. And that's slightly away from the professional services risk side of things, but it is important. From a risk perspective, when it comes to blurring boundaries, I contrast how we communicate with clients now compared to how we did when I started out as a young lawyer. All correspondence then was sent by letter, by paper letter. It was rare even to use email. So everything came into a central point in the office where it was read by a partner or someone quite senior, and then responses were sort of read and filtered through as well. So now you've got much more touch points within a business, informal communication. People may be communicating between the professional services firm and the client at all sorts of different levels. And that too, I think, brings with it an element of increased risk potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. The increased number of funnels of communication between organisations, I think, is a really important point. It's not just central checked and audited and then gone on to the right person anymore. It's, as we say, lots of people individually messaging each other, whether that be kind of group chats or one-on-one messaging as well. And I think this concept of paid advice versus unpaid advice is really important as well. Is that something that you run into, Chris, where you have to specify to clients?
Yes, but however, as a professional, I always say to my clients, even if they're not paying me, I'm still giving some form of advice. And so therefore, even if they're not a client, I can still be held accountable. If you go do X, Y, Z, I don't know, for one example, somebody could have a travel claim and they can go, Chris, what do I need to do on this? Oh, well, you can trigger it by doing this, this, and this. They go ahead and do that. They could spend some money thinking they're going to get insurance claim back for it, but they're devil's in the detail. It's all within the policy wordings. Oh no, this is excluded. This is excluded. And I could be talking to somebody at a local sports club or somebody on the bus, and they can then take that as gospel. And once they've taken that, they can come back to me. But you said this, and it's not even just insurance brokers, but also some solicitors would give free advice, and we would come in and give 30 minutes of free guidance. And claims have occurred from that, even though it's not being paid. So it's a Samaritan Act that we have. Even a doctor that will treat somebody out on the street, and as a first aid, they can still be held accountable, even though they weren't that person's patient, and they might not know some of their person's background. So whatever we're doing, paid or unpaid, we're all still going to be accountable for.
Absolutely. How do professionals protect themselves against that as well? What are some of the methods that you use to make sure that there's that the boundaries are clear?
Personally, there's two major points. It's your housekeeping. If ever I have or do give somebody some guidance, I always follow it up with an email with all parties, like minutes of the meeting, saying, this is what we spoke about, this is what I said to you, this is what we agree going forward. So whether it be that I could be WhatsApping somebody on a train or on or talking to someone, I'll follow that up on Monday with our conversations, and if you want to move it forward, fair enough. But then that opens up the can of worms of well, if I'm working on the train with WhatsApp, can somebody else see that information? If I'm working on a laptop, can somebody see that information? I work from home, so do I have my files out on the coffee table and somebody comes to visit, they can see client information? And this then falls back onto the Data Protection Act rules. So people have to be mindful that whether it be WhatsApp or working from home, when working and giving a working activity, it should be done in a manner of a working professional.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure you have some examples from the case law here, Lucy. But I mean, what sort of thing does the law say about this blurring of the boundaries? Does it still count as advice if it's unpaid?
Yeah, in terms of free advice, absolutely. So that there was a Court of Appeal decision about 8 or 9 years ago now, the Burgess and Legenbarn decision that says, just because advice is provided free of charge or services are provided free of charge, that doesn't mean that no duty of care arises. So just because there is no payment per se, that doesn't mean there isn't a duty. attaching to the advice that's given. And I've certainly seen cases in front of the Financial Ombudsman Service as well, where advisors have said, well, that was just an informal chat. That wasn't part of the advice. I wasn't paid for that. And the Ombudsman Service has said, no, you assumed a duty because somebody asked you for advice about, a trust or an inheritance tax point. You gave advice. The fact that you didn't enter into a retainer or charge is neither here nor there. You've assumed duty. Picking up on the points that Chris said about protecting against that risk, totally agree. Documenting what's been said after the fact, following up with slightly more formal methods of communication, ensuring that anything informal is properly documented and added to the file is really important. And also prior to that, I'd highlight the importance of letters of retainer, TOBAs, contracts, which right at the start of a relationship can set out the scope, for example, of how variations to a contract or retainer can be agreed. So going back to Max's point about scope creep, I don't think professionals can or even want to stop the informal channels of communication. But a retainer letter or a contract can, for example, make clear that any variations to the contract can only be agreed by a particular person or by a particular method, so that you can still have those informal channels, but ensure that anything more formal in terms of the scope of the retainer, the fee for the work or anything like that has to be dealt with in a slightly more formal way. So that might be one approach that we see going forwards.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've just had a question come in live from the Q&A. It's from an anonymous person, so I don't know your name, I'm afraid. But it says on emails, you have exactly that opportunity to state specific disclaimers regarding legal obligations, including kind of conduct, out of hours working, legislation, data privacy. Could those be added to WhatsApp? Would that kind of indemnify people against some of the risks that we're talking about here?
I don't think as a matter of practicality you can add something to every WhatsApp, but as I said, I think you can at the outset make clear what can and can't be communicated or contractually binding via WhatsApp. And if people aren't doing so already, I suspect we'll start to see that built into letters of retainer. Yeah.
Max, I see you nodding there. I know this is something that you've got opinions on as well. I mean, what do you think of that?
So generally, even in our practice, and I'm sure Chris will probably agree or add, even conversations like the one we're having today could be interpreted by our listeners as some form of an advice or an opinion on coverage or response. And I know for a fact that my claims legal colleagues always say, as an underwriter, you should always say claims are viewed on specific merit and circumstance, and whatever we say is kind of a general opinion on the matter rather than specific advice. So I absolutely echo any form of trying to formalize the relationship. As an insurer in this sector, obviously we try not to be prescriptive to how our clients conduct themselves. We don't want them to lose the ability to be nimble and conduct their business quickly in sort of a modern manner by having to draft pages upon pages upon pages of disclaimers. What we found useful, and we've put this into one of the recommendations at the end of the report, is that a simple contact matrix or some form of a guidance that basically says, these are the matters we're okay talking to you about informally, but should the matters get a bit more technical or a bit more strict, or as Lucy says, if it becomes a material addendum or a change to the original contract, then they maybe should be discussed in a more formal manner. And just having that agreed upon sort of takes away the pressure and sort of draws the boundary. It doesn't have to be binding, but it helps both parties sort of know where they stand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. And I think one of the recommendations of your report was not to say, look, this is an issue that affects our underwriting, but please think about this as a issue that will potentially become more of an issue in the future as well. And a very good point on the disclaimer. And I guess maybe it's up to me to say that the discussion we are having today does not represent any sort of professional advice, so please don't take it as such. And that's a good point to be made, Maxim. But I think it's a really important point, and it's such a wide-ranging issue that we're talking about, where communications can be misinterpreted and the risks that can come alongside them as well. And I know, Chris, when we were catching up before the webinar, you told me about a story where you'd had a travel insurance claim come through that kind of illustrated what some of the boundaries of this issue can blur around. Maybe it would be great for you to tell that.
Yeah. A few weeks ago, this is when missiles were flying over Iran. Somebody's son was over in Sri Lanka, and they can't fly back to Dubai. It's going to cost an extra £2,000 to get them back home. It's a Saturday. I have the son WhatsApping me because there's no telephone service, so he can't really talk. He can only send me 1 or 2 points on their WhatsApp. Got the father on the phone saying, "Chris, what can we make an insurance claim? Can I pay the extra to give him across?" So I check the government website. I even call up the insurer and I say the particulars that I know and say, "Is this sort of covered?" Just to double check. I know the answer is yes, but I want some clarity. Yes, pay the extra. We can get this claim through on there. But because of the speed and because of the detail, at one point I didn't ask the question on the age. And the son, I could perceive as being 18, 19, was actually 29 and was relying upon business insurance rather than personal travel insurance. So the main point is get the son home, got to be safe. But by having all the rush, it's a case of, no, you can't make an insurance claim because of these reasons. If it wasn't under pressure, or I was going through the process of here's a fact find, who are the full names and addresses and dates of births of everyone, it would have been highlighted. So yeah, communications off the cuff, under pressure, these are areas where most professions can fall foul of, which is why I always strongly recommend whatever said, follow it up, do your housework. So on the Monday morning, the first thing I did was follow it up by an email to the company secretary. This happened, this is what this is, this. And I've gone, absolutely fine. Because I followed it up, I followed due process. Because at the beginning, when you mentioned having disclaimers on WhatsApp, you can have so much red tape in place that it actually dilutes the advice you're giving. And quite often I will have a summary page. This is what you've asked for. This is what I'm giving you. But I will follow it up now with all these other FCA regulated pages of all these things that you need to highlight and check. But it's a fine balance of being risk proactive in mitigating any risks on yourself, to then diluting your advice so much that it's hidden in a 150-page contract. So it's about finding a balance and doing your homework thereafter.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an incredible story to illustrate the point, because it's something that you're doing a favour for someone essentially on the weekend, and then because of something that you've missed, it comes that the claim can't be paid, and that's no fault of anyone except for the kind of informal communication. But as we say, I mean, this is such a wide-ranging issue, and it's not just because of the methods of communication that we're talking about, but it's the content. But what it also is the CPS sector is so diverse in itself, and obviously you're an insurance broker, so you have particular perspective on the issue, Chris. But we, as a sector looking at the CPS, there's so many different professions in there, some of them more regulated than others, some of them less. And are there particular risks that different professions within that CPS umbrella face? Is that something you could speak to, Lucy?
Yeah, I think that's right. If we're looking at these sorts of informal communication channels, and also awareness of risk and claim risk, I think some of the more traditional professionals like lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, insurance brokers, big construction companies, they'll be alive to these risks. They'll have policies in place, and critically, as well as the policies, they ought to have compliance and training in place to make sure that people are abiding with them. But where it comes to maybe some of the newer professions and emerging professions, I think that's where we're likely to see perhaps more of these informal communications. We've mentioned a few already, but things as well like Instagram messages, that sort of thing. It's all sorts of different channels and different ways that people communicate, particularly if you're talking about interior designers, estate agents, and I can certainly see there being different risks, and perhaps less of an awareness of the risks that can arise of inadvertently entering into a contract, or scope creep, or that sort of thing that could arise with those more emerging professions.
Yeah, absolutely, Max. I know that the research looked at a wide range of surveyed people for the research as well. So, I mean, what did that show about the different professions and the risks they face?
So I don't think the report itself specifically goes into various professions, but I can speak to it from experience. So out of our population of customers, as I said, yeah, we do have a very clear divide between what Lucy said are more traditional professions, often regulated, but then there is the whole population, probably substantially bigger in size and number, well, definitely in number, maybe not in kind of corporate financial size, of professions that won't necessarily even think of having a contract when engaging. Like, I don't know the last time any of us had a written contract with a personal trainer, or if you're that way inclined, a lifestyle coach or a nutritionist or whatever. Like, all these are fantastic examples of professional services that are provided for a fee, but in a manner that doesn't really stack up with the like of an accountant or a legal advisor. And that's something again that we wanted to highlight with the report, that the spectrum is so broad, but the risks are sort of similar.
Yeah, I think that's the other side of it, is that while the professional services sector is so diverse, it's actually kind of all of the risks all feel quite similar for them, as you just said. And is there something? What is the thing from the report that you would say that clients feel most uncomfortable with this new method of communication?
What I personally found quite interesting is the feeling of pressure of being always sort of required to be there, and also the feeling of pressure of getting something wrong. I think people, especially professionals, intrinsically feel responsible for what they say. And I don't think it's lost on anyone that if they are speaking to a paying client, that their messages could be misinterpreted, even if the situation itself never kind of arisen or never became a dispute. And I think that adds to the pressure. So 42% of our respondents felt that pressure. They actually saw it as a negative. And it was like the other side of the coin of being nimble and flexible and available and being able to win business by just being kind of switched on and active, versus feeling that pressure, feeling the need to acknowledge client's message on a Saturday night and maybe needing to reply if the message sort of had some form of urgency to it. And also, yeah, the fear of getting it wrong, like that can really kind of bring certain pressures to people's lives. And yeah, that definitely came through in the report.
Absolutely, I think it's something we've probably all experienced as well. Is that when something isn't as clear as informal communications often are when compared to more formal communications, there is that worry about sometimes not knowing exactly what someone's meant, and you do have to act based on how you've understood something. But when that's not clear, that can really lead to issues as well. And I see you nodding, Lucy. I mean, that's something that you can speak to, I'm sure.
Absolutely, I think that's completely right. And I think what Max says goes back to the point about the blurring of boundaries. And there's the blurring of boundaries between people's professional time and personal time, particularly now we all work in a more hybrid way. The sort of widening of the bandwidth between clients and professionals, and the number of touch points, which means that there's perhaps more direct communication at different levels than there was many years ago. And I think linked to that as well, and the blurred boundaries, is even things like the issue of what device and what number are people using. So increasingly people can use personal devices, and I'm sure this is a risk that Chris and Max can speak to as well, in terms of perhaps questions that are asked about what devices people are using, how they're communicating with their clients. And when people are able to use their own devices for work communications, obviously that contributes to that blurring of boundaries point. But also, in a slightly more sinister way, there is that increased risk with off-channel communications on devices that perhaps aren't being monitored by the professional services firm, or that they don't have access to. And certainly, regulators in the financial services sector in particular are increasingly concerned about off-channel communications, because that brings with it the risk of things like market abuse. And there have been some quite high-profile cases in the press recently in the US about insider trading between law firms and financial services firms, and the ability to send those off-channel messages in that informal way is part of the associated risk there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially because they're encrypted, or you can even have messages that are set to disappear within a certain amount of time that I personally don't use in my personal life. But I can see that that risk is there, especially for something like that as well. And as Lucy said, Chris, is that something that you can speak to about the blurring of boundaries between devices that are actually used for these communications?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It all stems down to you have junior staff that shouldn't be expected to use their own personal devices or be out of working out of hours and out of time and not have that pressure, because they may not be as certain in the advice that they're giving or the activity that they're doing. So, if in any doubt, junior staff should always revert to senior staff. Those senior staff are probably more flexible or are working later in the hours, and that way they can keep their home life. And while senior staff are probably more flexible, just so they can maintain a good balance between family and work life. But when using, say, a personal device, and I'm talking to a client one day and a document could be downloaded, my daughter could be looking at my phone the next day trying to get Amazon Music on there, and she's then technically got access to client data. And is that appropriate? Have I signed an NDA? Should that client be known that I'm working with that person? And my daughter could easily innocently say a name out loud, and suddenly that's a data breach in itself. So whether it be personal phones, personal computers, personal offices, there is a grey area of what is too much, what is too little. But it's definitely something that needs to be documented. What is the process? If key clients we approach in this manner, general advice we approach in another manner, which would be the normal 9 to 5 situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the seismic shock of everybody starting to work from home has definitely made that even more important as well. I mean, I don't know if you can even say people started to work from home anymore. It's been a couple of years, hasn't it? But I don't know if we have quite dealt with the impacts that has had on the methods of working. So I think really important point. And is that something that you've come across as well, Max? The kind of device debate around what's appropriate?
Yes, absolutely. So when we talk of devices, again, I think you've covered quite a lot of that as well. So there's the data angle for sure. So um, the other angle that we also come across with the professions is blurring of the line of kind of in certain professions, you actually like charge for your advice, like replying on a Saturday evening on maybe a trivial but nevertheless legal matter. Does it constitute a billable sort of occurrence for an interaction with a client?
Mm.
How do you keep record of it? How does that become part of your overall sort of billable dynamic and things like that? So those things definitely came up both in our research and kind of lived experience
Yeah.
as well. So yeah, and I said we internally also do encourage, especially kind of younger, less experienced staff to not feel like they need to engage in professional off channel communication after hours, whether kind of more senior people like myself. I'm at brokers back and call 24/7, genuinely. As much as I hate saying it, it's the truth.
No, as you say, I mean, it's an interesting point that you bring up there as well. It is something that means that you can't ever really switch off. And we've got a question in the Q&A. And this one's another anonymous one, but it talks about the human factor and the toll that this sort of communication environment has on clients. Um, I mean, and I guess yourselves as well that are working within the professional services sectors, that do they feel they can ever switch off, or do you have to be constantly willing to respond to clients? And what sort of risks does that create as well? What about you, Chris?
Yeah. Well, that all can stem down to a lot of nurturing mental well-being. So the pressures is some senior staff can lean upon junior staff to like be there, do this, do this, do this, and feel that they pressurise that they have to be around 24/7. But then that has a negative effect of mental well-being. And in my view, junior staff shouldn't ever feel pressurised. They should be able to see a good clear line of being with their family, being at home, being able to close off. And it's not until they ask the question, can I take that next step? I want to be more available to my clients. It should be a personal choice rather than being pressurized to do something. And like Max, I myself, yeah, work 24/7. But that gives me the flexibility that during the middle of the day, I could potentially have a longer break and I can go see my family. So it's about having that choice of time with both sides, the clients and the family itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that something that you experience as well, Lucy? I mean, the need to have those boundaries between work and life?
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, there can be all sorts of benefits to the ability to work flexibly and to be available out of hours, but in a more nimble way, so that you're not always at your desk. And certainly, when I started out, being available to clients meant being physically at your desk or next to the landline phone. And now we're able to, blend. Again, it comes back to that boundaries point, doesn't it? We're blending work and home life in a way that's, really quite new to many of us. I agree with what Chris says about needing to make sure that people feel empowered so they don't always have to answer messages. And I suppose from my perspective, as somebody who tends to see only the negative outcomes, because I deal with claims against professionals, I would highlight that there is a risk issue with people being always on and not having the opportunity to regroup or take time to consider what the proper response is and have that time to reflect on a letter and the right response. So I think that's an important message to all professional services firms, that yes, it's great for clients for us always to be available and responsive, but there are risks associated with that need to be carefully thought of, whether that's claims risk or actually just looking after the people that work for us.
Yeah, and there's both sides of the coin as well. I mean, where we're talking about insurance for CPS clients, I mean, those clients need to be protected, but then the people on the other end of that spectrum also need to be making sure that they are operating in the correct way and providing the right advice, because that's what it's about at the end of the day. So obviously, I want to end on the recommendations from the report and from each one of you about how to manage this risk as well. But before that, I want to get through some of the questions that have built up while we've been speaking, and they've touched on some of the elements that we have brought up in the discussion that I think is worthy of slightly more discussion. So there's one here about what I think we were talking about was disappearing messages. Obviously, something that's really important in all of these communications is record keeping, making sure that you have a record of emails. And I know, Chris, that you said that you send an email to someone just laying out the points that have been discussed, even after off-channel communications, for example. But the risks that come from disappearing formats like Snapchat or disappearing messages on WhatsApp, what risk does that create, and how do you make sure that record keeping keeps up with that sort of thing?
Is that me?
Yes, Blair, you can start, Chris.
Yeah, quite easily seen in the media is that if messages are being deleted, why are they being deleted? What are you trying to hide? It can straight away give a negative view. What were you talking about last week? What did you agree? And it could be insider trading. It could be something political, but that in itself causes a bad risk, and you then haven't got that previous information to back up on it. So that's always a scary situation for me to think of, which is why, like you said, I always follow it up with a documented piece of documentation that can be filed away on a case file in itself. So always be wary, and whether it be WhatsApp, Snapchat, and even a conversation, say down at the cricket club, if it wasn't written down, it didn't happen. Or it could be he said, she said situation, and it would go against you, because being a professional, you have a duty of care, and as a professional you'd be expected to actually have documented something and keep things transparent. And it's all about transparency and acknowledgement, is what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously in the legal profession, record keeping is paramount, Lucy, but what's your advice on that?
Absolutely. I mean, just talking about the different means of communication there and disappearing messages, I have to say I've yet to come across anybody giving advice via Snapchat, or even indeed to have opened Snapchat myself. I'm vaguely aware of what it is. But things like disappearing messages, obviously, one hates to speak in absolutes, but in the context of a client and a professional, it's difficult to think of a situation where disappearing messages would really be appropriate. There needs to be documented record, even if you are using WhatsApp or something like that to communicate with a client. And for anything formal, obviously the more formal methods are probably better, but where it is being used, where the client wants to communicate that way, the SRA guidance is clear. Firms that are using WhatsApp need to make sure that the advice is properly supervised, that there's a record of it on the client file. So it needs to be, you know, screenshotted and added to whatever case management system the firm is using, so it's there on the client file. And the client is also entitled to it. So, you know, where a client's being charged, WhatsApp messages are part of their file. They're entitled to see a copy, so they need to be properly downloaded, documented, and retained. I think there's another point there, as well as, you know, the sort of the platforms. So, you know, the WhatsApp, the Snapchat, the Slack, whatever it is that you're using. Inherently, if you're using these informal communications, probably doing it on a phone. I think, you know, 95% of what we're talking about is done on a phone. So it's not just, you know, the fact that you're using the WhatsApp program, it's actually the fact that you're doing it on a small device that you can drop or break or can fall out of your pocket. And we're all aware of the, you know, the cases around disclosure and phones purportedly falling into the sea and that sort of thing. But actually the statistics on the number of phones that get lost in the UK every year are extraordinary. It's in the hundreds of thousands. So there's also a security issue there, both in terms of a record and retention of the advice, but also a data issue. So I think that's worth flagging as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's surprising how many people lose phones until I did it myself, and it really is very easy to do if you're not paying complete attention. And if you're on 24/7, I can imagine that's even bigger of a risk. And yeah. Is there something there that you could add at all, Max, about the importance of record keeping and the dangers of disappearing messages?
Sure. Well, I will probably add a slightly different flavor to it also. As a professional in a regulated environment, I hate disappearing messages. I never use them. I never allowed them to be used in professional communications with me. However, a lot of our clients live in a completely different world, especially in the more of an emerging professions kind of scenario. I can easily envisage a young, nimble, internet-based designer having disappearing messages with multiple clients, sharing various design features that may no longer be there in 24 hours unless they're paid for or taken up on. Some platforms and services are even set up in such a way that it becomes part of the business model. So we as an insurer absolutely don't want to be prescriptive. We don't want to demand of our clients, you can't use disappearing messages. And if you use disappearing messages, you must take certain steps the way we do in our regulated environments. That's why, as I said, our advice is just, look, consider your own risks, think about how they impact on what you do, but we as your insurer will be there. So we don't prescribe this, we don't make this an underwriting point or an exclusion point in our policy. We just say, look, for some professions like us, the insurance professionals or legal professionals, there are certain boundaries and there are certain procedures. For some other more emerging, more nimble, more sort of quirkier, more sort of less regulated professions, disappearing messages could be the feature. It may be at the core of what they do. And who are we to tell them otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a sensible approach to not be prescriptive on these things, and I think that's one of the more positive parts of the report that Hiscox put together, is that, you know, this is an invitation to think about the risks of this communication style rather than a concrete advice. Although we will get to some pointers at the end, I think. But just we've got time for one more question before we get to that. It's related to something that you were just messaging, Lucy, about how the communications about a client and to a client have to be put onto their file as well. I mean, there's also a risk, is there not, around the importance of internal communication, so within an organisation, and about how those are had with the client as well. Are those risks that you can foresee?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, there's much more informal communication within organisations now as well. And, you know, I'm thinking probably about law firms in particular, but it applies to a wide range of professionals. People need to remember, you know, those internal messaging channels are potentially disclosable, something that people can look at. So just taking care about things like tone and language. Particularly, I've certainly dealt with cases where Teams messages have become disclosable as part of the case, and people have perhaps, written something off the cuff in a Teams message that, some years later, when it's in front of a court, they rather wish that they hadn't put something in a particular way. So it's definitely something to be mindful of. And Teams itself is an interesting platform because it has sort of built-in disappearing messages on it. So, for example, if you record a Teams meeting, it will only be retained by the platform for a particular period of time unless it's specifically downloaded and saved. So again, coming back to those issues around, governance, compliance, making sure that things are properly recorded and saved if they form part of the file.
Yeah, absolutely. That is quite worrying advice. I may go and clear some of my Teams messages up after this webinar. But as you say, it is something that can become admissible, and the importance of kind of communicating in a fair and professional way, even when it is to your own colleagues, I think is something that does probably bear highlighting as well. I see you nodding as well, Max. Is that something that you'd recommend?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And anything to add, Chris, on that point about the kind of internal communications?
Yeah, internal communications, whether that be the company itself talking to their staff, or even just staff members talking to other staff members. When you are more informal, you're more relaxed, and when you're more relaxed, you're more jokey, friendly. And some jokes could be a joke to some people because they know the context, but if somebody else is just overhearing something or seeing it on a group chat, there's lots of internal group chats that happens between different departments, and what may seem funny with one or two people I've seen is inappropriate to somebody else. And because was that a business conversation, or was you just talking about football and somebody was stumbling and they make a comment about the footballer itself? So with informal communications, you run the risk of having those inappropriate conversations sometimes. So whether it be informal, if it's within work and you're talking to work colleagues, it should be at a business level, that communication.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's excellent advice, and I absolutely take the point that a joke that you make on a Teams chat may look very different printed out in black and white in front of a inquiry, and I can see the humour being sucked out of any situation like that as well. We are coming to the end, so what I wanted to end on, panelists, was some recommendations. So how you guys would suggest that professional services organisations manage these risks. I know, as you said, Max, that you don't want to be prescriptive about things, but what would you suggest the people working in this sector do to manage the risk of this informal communication?
So towards the end of the report itself, we tried to actually put a couple of snippets of what we consider to be just something to think about, good advice, maybe good practice. I already touched on earlier on what we call creating the channel matrix between the parties, just to say, look, in our experience, when over the lifetime of our professional engagement, these are the kind of subjects that could be discussed informally. These are the kind of subjects that probably warrant an email during working hours. These are the kind of things we should only be discussing at partner level in writing.
Yeah.
Just having that sort of basic generic agreement that doesn't necessarily spill across 5 or 6 or 7 pages could take a lot of stress out of the situation. It draws a soft boundary. It helps parties understand where they stand, where it's appropriate to maybe not respond to a message that you feel doesn't fit the spirit of that matrix, and referring to the matrix to say, this shouldn't have really been sent to me on a Saturday night. It could have waited until a Monday, 10 o'clock, kind of thing. So that's one of the useful ones. The other one as well, back to the conversation we had on disclaimers. Instead of having disclaimers, how about training our people and maybe giving them some of the words that could be kind of naturally introduced into their sort of WhatsAppy messagey kind of style. So instead of using a strict disclaimer to say, winky face, and by the way, I don't mean this is a formal agreement, or something like that.
Yeah.
Keeping it light, keeping it nimble, but also keeping it professional. Just something to think about.
Absolutely. I think it's that sort of balance that needs to come into our management of these scenarios as well. And is that something you'd echo, Chris, or anything else that you would add as a recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, 3 key words sort of come out of this conversation that we've had is, first of all, acknowledgement. Companies, firms, they need to acknowledge that there is a risk. But they don't need to batten down onto their staff members, you need to do it this way or it's the highway. It's acknowledgement, and then letting staff know, just use caution. Make yourself aware of your surroundings and the medium that you are communicating on. If you're talking on the train, people may overhear that conversation, or they might see your screen laptop. So acknowledgement and caution, housekeeping, good housekeeping. If you follow up everything with good housekeeping, it should deal with 99% of the issues that actually do occur.
Absolutely. I think that's, again, sensible and pretty comprehensive advice from you both. And anything to add to it, Lucy? I know it's always hard to go last with this.
I think picking up on all the points that Chris and Max have made, and also, the Hiscox report itself, it's a really fascinating read, and looking at the statistics of, how all this has been embedded into the professional services industry, how common it is to communicate in this way. It's very, very quickly, as I said at the beginning of this session, become, really a huge part of what many professionals do. So I think it's, acknowledging that it's not just a risk issue, it's not just a claim issue, it's not just a record keeping issue, it's holistic, it's embedded in everything that professionals are now starting to do. So it's about all of those things. It's also about governance, it's about culture, and it's about, senior management. So I think, thinking about it in the round in that way, and not just categorizing it as a record keeping issue or a risk issue is really important.
Excellently said. I think that word holistic is really important, and I think that really does speak to the heart of the issue, is that it is a societal change that we're facing into with specific impacts on this sector that we're all talking about today. But as you said, I'm afraid we have run out of time, but I'd just like to echo what you said there, Lucy, which is, for anybody that is really interested in this discussion and would like to delve a little deeper into it, I do recommend that you go have a look at that Hiscox report. It's free, available on the website, and really does dig into some of the stats around this issue and the pressures that people are feeling. And again, as Max said, some recommendations there at the end for how that risk can be managed. But with that, I'm afraid all I have left to say is thank you very much for joining our discussion. Thank you to our panelists for having it with us. Thank you to our sponsor, Hiscox, for making it all possible. And to everybody watching, please have a lovely rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.